do you think that there's a chance that NATO will fall apart?
Well, I think you have to say there is a chance now. I mean, it's obviously under some severe strains. Because the U.S. Or NATO rather was dominated by the U.S. It was entirely. Trump has never liked NATO, and I think he's right about that. It should have ended when the Cold War ended. Um, I don't think he's going to attempt to destroy it, directly, just simply withdraw. That seems to me unlikely. But the 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 course that he's charting now is going to greatly weaken NATO. Um, let's say just the one thing that he said consistently, and a lot of people back him up on this, not just Trump supporters, who say, hey, the Europeans should pay their fair share because really the U.S. has been um, allowing the Europeans a free ride, in terms of military expenditures. So their expenditures have been very minimal, and they've instead chosen to put their money into things like social welfare and so forth. That's the one reason that Europe is able to have the lifestyle, the social systems that Europe has now. Um, so Trump has been insisting on 5%. Maybe that's high. I don't know what I think the U.S. percentage is not quite that high, but it's been very low. Previously, it was 2%, and most countries never even met that. Um, but let's say if he succeeds in that, and then the Europeans actually do up their percentages to something close to 5%, and if they really believe in this Russian threat, it seems amazing to me they haven't done this already. Again, it's just like they're all about rhetoric and the narrative. They just kind of think if we keep on repeating things, but you just don't see very much in the way of any kind of real sacrifice, let's say, on the part of Europeans. But if they do, well, that actually makes the Europeans less dependent on the U.S. Right now, because they had this free ride, kind of like Hungary vis-a-vis the EU, European NATO vis-a-vis the U.S., was dependent on them. So they were subject to U.S. pressures in a way. They really had to listen to the boss back in Washington. But if they do, in fact, put up more of a substantial amount of their own money, they will be much less dependent on the U.S. and they may start to chart an independent course, which could mean the end of NATO.
Well, when they put up more money, isn't it just a grift basically to buy American munitions and equipment that's
Well,
overpriced?
that's the problem. Yeah, well, that's the problem is that they don't really have a military industrial complex to speak of. The only country that did to any extent was Germany, but it's shown itself to be really incapable of meeting the needs of of the war that we're seeing in Ukraine. Much less an all-out Russian NATO war, which God forbid, will never happen. I don't want that to ever happen, but.
So yeah, just saying they bump it up to 5% just means that they're just going to be giving that money to America for overpriced goods, right? It doesn't help them chart an independent course.
Yeah,
and that's what it does is they get pissed off. They're like, we're paying way too much, not getting enough bang for our buck, and then they say, you know what, we're going to break out of NATO and we can enter the open market, and then we can buy weapons from Russia, from China. It'll be competitive, and then the MIC in the United States would just collapse because.
Right. Well, of course, if you're really talking about defense, you do want to develop your own native industries so that you're not dependent on any other country that could be a potential adversary or, at least an ally of or an ally of a potential adversary. And their MIC is woefully inadequate at this point. And it takes a long time to build up something like that. I think, we're talking about a decade or decades.
Yeah, I imagine decades.
Yeah, so just spending money, you're right. If you don't have the capacity, just spending a lot of money just raises the price of the limited items that you have. So let's say if, there becomes a bidding war, there's more dollars, or rather here, euros out there in chasing a limited number of munitions. Well, what happens? If the supply doesn't go up, this is basic economics. The prices just go up. That's what happens. So you spend more money, but in the end, you don't really get anything more for it. You need to do more than that. You need to actually build up, this entire ecology of industries, and of general industry, and also military, civilian industry, and military industry, which will to a great extent depend on civilian industry. But much of Europe, is deindustrialized. Like the one exception was Germany, but we see them going down the path of deindustrialization now. So this is, we're talking about a huge, huge challenge for them, and it's not going to be fixed by some decision made in Brussels. There's going to have to be a huge commitment on the part of all the countries, and I don't know how they're going to coordinate, because they would have to coordinate. You can't just have the Latvians doing one thing and the Poles doing another, or whatever. You'd end up with a mess. There's no interoperability, and these countries in themselves have limited resources. It would have to be, if you're going to compete with a power like Russia or the U.S. for that matter, or China, it would have to be a Europe-wide effort, and Brussels really hasn't shown the ability to do anything like that. There's recently von der Leyen declared that the EC, the European Commission, had a plan to make 800 billion euros available to EU countries for just for building up military industries. But what that meant was that it would just be available in the form of loans. And, most of these countries already have a great deal of debt. It didn't really sound like a plan at all. I mean, I don't see how that's going to make any difference.
Do you think that's a path that Europe should even chart? Try to build up its own European military industrial complex? I mean, are they really at risk? I mean, America's not going to invade them. Russia, I know they, maybe, I don't think they really think it, but Russia's not going to invade them either. Right. So, what if you were in charge? I mean, it just seems like, okay, everybody, we got to buckle down and we got to become a military power of our own. Where are we starting from? We're starting from pretty much zero. We got nothing. We have huge amounts of debt. We got to, who knows if the EU is going to even survive in the next 10, 20 years.
Right.
So, I mean, you don't have cohesion. It just seems like, I don't know if it's a venture that they should do, or do you think it's necessary that Europe does become a strong military power to establish itself as a big pole in this multipolar world?
Yeah. Well, it's a difficult question. I mean, there were certain advantages to NATO back in the day. I mean, it was a British lord, I can't remember his name, who said that the purpose of NATO was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. You could rephrase it and say that an important part of it was not just the potential enemy, which was the Soviet Union in that day, but also the it imposed a certain at least military unity on Europe, which worked very well for decades, especially when America was so prosperous, and it allowed again the European nations to devote their money not to militaries, but to not to military spending, but to social spending, and to the and it contributed greatly to the prosperity of Europe. One of the dangers, let's say, if NATO really ends and you don't have, let's say, a single, a unified bloc that is actually, again, dominated by the U.S., is that you don't have a power to keep the Germans down. And then there is a potential of, let's say, okay, if there really is a move towards an increase in military spending, just on the NATO's gone on the part of separate European powers, then we find ourselves returning to the old Europe, which was often war torn. There was there's a potential anyway. There's a fear. Maybe it's not justified. I don't think it's justified at all in the short run, but in the long run, it probably is. It's just that a fear that that we could see war within Europe. You mean between the different NATO powers if NATO in fact leaves? Again, I don't see that at all now. So there is something to be said for this larger structure, just to, maybe to have, if not NATO, some replacement for it, just to kind of to keep all the countries on board and unified and not looking at, looking at each other as a potential threat, not having an arms race within Europe. But it's messy. It's hard to do. The challenge is for Europe is that there is a danger in having these independent countries, but the independent countries are real. The French are French, the Germans are Germans, and the Germans are willing to do something to sacrifice for their own people, and vice versa for and the same is true for the French. I don't think anybody really. You say, well, the alternative is we can have a central power in Brussels. But what you find is that nobody really wants to sacrifice for Brussels. It's this kind of gray bureaucratic entity that nobody is going to ever be enthusiastic about. Maybe you can make these arguments for it, but it's sort of like, maybe the Chinese are proud of China, the Russians are proud of Russia, but I don't know that the Europeans are proud of the EU. It's not the same thing. So they're in kind of a fix. I don't know what the solution is.
Right. Well, I mean, you're saying that there's a risk of potentially a future conflict if they build up their own individual militaries, and that's true if we look at history. But NATO has got us into our current conflict now. So it's just like having a centralized government. Especially if it's built around hating Russia. That just could potentially lead to another conflict.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I mean, it's just like what I was saying, the argument for, a larger European authority is the same thing. You can say it's sort of like a miniature version or regional version, or maybe we can talk about a single continent, Europe, as opposed to the globalist vision. Because the globalist vision actually is, it's undergirded by the same kind of thinking. It's like, we need to have like this one world, right? And if we can impose this one vision and upon the whole world, really impose it. I mean, that there really would be a rules-based international order, which is, of course, centered really in Washington and then secondarily in Brussels. We can bring an end to war. That's the idea, because everybody would be under essentially this one world government, or at least would have to bow to this one power, and that way peace can be maintained. That's how often what believers in this global hegemony will say. Their fear is that if this global hegemonic vision ends and the U.S. and Europe retreat from much of the world, well, then there will be this power vacuum, and then wars will erupt, because in their mind they were keeping the peace. Now, of course, the problem with that, as you pointed out, is that over the last couple of decades, or last few decades, most of the world's major wars in the world are were actually caused by the same vision. It was this insistence on maintaining global hegemony and not respecting the sovereignty of different countries. So, yeah, you do make a good point. The same thing, I think you can make the same argument for a central European authority versus having independent states. You can never eliminate the danger of war. But I think, again, right, if the multipolar world is not any guarantee of peace, but it's I think the only way we can go. I mean, it's just in the end, it's actually better for those smaller countries, again, because it gives them options in a way that they don't have now.
Guys, thanks for listening. Please like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And if you haven't checked it out yet, please check out my website, nobliski.io. You can look at the pinned comment below. it's something that I think you'll find useful. Even my dad uses it. My wife uses it. Instead of Googling things, you should be using this website because you get access to OpenAI, Perplexity, Anthropic, DeepSeek. There's hundreds of models that you can use. It's what I use to create the thumbnail images, things like this. And the greatest thing about it is there's no rate limits. There are no subscription fees. It's free to try out and use. You get free tokens every day. So if you're not a heavy AI user, you will never have to pay for anything. But this is really my passion project. I really want to get it off the ground, and I think you guys would like it. So yeah, check it out. Let me know what you think. And if you have time to download the apps and give it 5 stars, that'd mean a lot to me as well. Thanks a lot.